All right, welcome to the legislative review Tuesday. It's the last Tuesday review that we're doing because the session ends soon. And so we have this week and I think next week left in the session. They do all kinds of things, a lot of movement, a lot of stuff taking place. So yeah, this is the last week. We'll talk about things online. But there have been a lot more bills still popping up, quite a few since last week. And I think we're up to almost 800 bills so far that have been proposed. We obviously haven't talked about even a fraction of those. But let me know if you have bills you'd like to talk about today, other things you're looking at, or if you want to jump into some of them that have come up in the last little bit. If you don't have anything, that's fine.
Hi, Austin. It's Janet.
Hey, Janet.
Hi, Tara. I'm curious what's likely to happen with HB 150, the water emergency or the emergency powers bill.
Okay.
I guess it's been circled. I don't really know exactly what that means. And also HB 131, which apparently is somehow tabled as well.
All right, let's look at both of those here.
That's the vaccine passport one.
So we have HB 150. We talked about this one in one or two of our times. And so it's showing us that it's currently placed on the Senate third reading calendar. So that means that this bill has made it through, since the original sponsor was a rep, it's made it through the House committee, the House, the Senate committee, and now it's up for vote in the Senate. So the chance of something making it that far and getting passed is pretty good. So it looks like this one has a pretty good shot of becoming law. I'm sure the governor would sign this if it went to him.
Although, it's clearly unconstitutional or illegal. Do you think they realize that? And they're just like, oh, well, it's okay.
Well, it's a little tough when we say that something's clearly unconstitutional, because even if something goes against the face of what the Constitution says, so for example, the Constitution says there shall be no law abridging the freedom of speech. The Supreme Court basically says, well, yes, that's what the Constitution says, but we always look, there's an analysis they do with constitutional questions. They always say, first, does it actually violate the Constitution as written? And sometimes they say no, even though we think it does. But then the second piece is that the Supreme Court will say, okay, it violates the Constitution as written, but do they have a sufficient justification for that to violate the Constitution? And so in things like speech and things like some of these other areas, they will say, yeah, this violates the pure reading of the freedom of speech, but the government has a sufficient interest or sufficient purpose in doing so. And so essentially what the way that the Constitution has been interpreted from the beginning, or for a very long time, is that the courts have always looked to actually morality and proper purpose, they would say, as the highest thing that governs in our nation. Because if there's a very strong, compelling moral reason to do something, they will let them do it, even though it violates the Constitution. And so it's interesting to look at and to understand that any constitutional right is subject to an analysis that says, what's the purpose behind it? So just as an example, the Constitution says no law abridging freedom of religion. essentially, or there shall be freedom of religion. But if there were a group that wanted to do human sacrifice as part of their religion, the law would say no. It'd say, even though the Constitution gives you the freedom of religion, we're not okay with human sacrifice, even if it's voluntarily, someone consents to be sacrificed or something, they'd still say no. And the courts would say, yeah, that may strike at your freedom of religion, but the government has a sufficient basis in morality, essentially, to say, yeah, no, we're not going to allow human sacrifice. That one's a little extreme. Another example is with freedom of speech, we have the government that says, currently the federal government says you're limited on the contributions you can give to a candidate. So if someone's running for office, you can only donate so much money to them, $2,000 to $3,000. And they say that the reason is because they want to stop you from being able to buy a public official. They're trying to stop corruption in government. And the Supreme Court, when they looked at those contribution limits, they said, yeah, this violates a person's freedom of speech because it's a form of speech for you to give as much money as you want to a candidate. They said, but the government has a compelling enough interest in stopping corruption. And so since corruption is such an issue and being able to buy candidates is such an issue that undermines the basis of government, we're going to let you violate the Constitution, essentially, and have that law in effect. And so any form of constitutional analysis always has, well, there's actually 3 steps. We talked about 2 so far. The third step is if they say, yes, it violates the Constitution. So second step is there sufficient justification for it? Is it compelling enough justification? If that's also yes, then the court will say, did they use the least restrictive means possible to accomplish that goal? So in the contribution limit example with speech, the federal government had put contribution limits on what you could give to a candidate to stop corruption and what you could spend on your own political speech. So if I wanted to go put up a billboard and say something, the Supreme Court also said, or the federal government for a time also said you can't do that. And so both those laws were challenged in a lawsuit. And again, the Supreme Court said, okay, this does violate the freedom of speech. Is there a compelling enough interest? Yeah, corruption is a compelling enough interest. And then they said, but are the means or the route chosen narrowly tailored? Now, are they just attacking the corruption element or are they doing something else? And so in the example of speech and limits on what you could spend, the court said, yeah, if it's to a candidate, that's tailored to stopping corruption. But they said this restriction on spending whatever you want, just your own expenditures to talk politically. They said if Austin just hires a billboard, or if Austin just pays for a billboard and puts up a billboard and never coordinates with a candidate, they said then he can't be buying a candidate. So there's no corruption. There's no corruption being addressed with that type of law. And so there, the court struck down the contribution limit on independent expenditures because they weren't tailored enough to address the corruption interest. So when we look at the Constitution and any of these bills and say is it unconstitutional or not, we have the first question of, well, does the Constitution allow it on its face? And if the Constitution allows it on its face, if it's just, yes, this power is there, then there's no constitutional question, nothing goes on. But if they say, no, the Constitution doesn't allow this, then they would ask, okay, it's not allowed by the Constitution on its face, but is there a sufficient moral justification for this law? So in this scenario, when talking about water emergencies, the government's going to argue that even if the Constitution says no, you can't give this power to the governor, they would argue that, look, it's a water emergency. That's a pretty compelling public interest to address. And whether a court accepts that notion of it's a compelling interest or not really delves into the heart of what a judge considers moral or not moral, or appropriate or not appropriate. And this compelling interest standard of what we allow the Constitution to be broken for and what we don't It's been really interesting to follow over the years. And it's where the judges have power to really loosely interpret or put in their own opinions and views, or substitute in true opinions and views of society. But it's always interesting to understand that even in our constitutional society, the real thing that governs is some level of morality that judges are kind of trying to reach and talk about and embrace. And different judges argue it differently. Some feel it's there, some feel it's not. And so on this one, from an attorney's perspective, would this bill be struck down as unconstitutional? Honestly, it'd probably be pretty slim chance if the means are tailored enough to address just the water emergencies that they're claiming might exist. Because the courts are probably going to say, yeah, water emergencies are pretty compelling public interest. If there's not enough water for people, they have to step in and act. And so again, I certainly appreciate you bringing up the constitutional concern, because under a strict reading of the Constitution, the legislature should not be delegating power to the governor. They're supposed to be independent bodies. The governor enforces the law. The governor's not supposed to be making law. But that fight on the constitutional grounds happened back in the 1920s, 1930s, when the federal government tried to create agencies, because it was the same thing. The legislature was giving power to the president, or in our case, the governor, to make rules and issue things like laws. And those were challenged. And Janet, to your point, having being unconstitutional, they were struck down the first two times as unconstitutional. So this ability to delegate powers from the legislature to the governor to make rules and laws was considered unconstitutional the first two times it came to the Supreme Court. But the third time it came to the Supreme Court, however it went down in society, people were blaming the Supreme Court for stopping what was necessary for them to recover from the Great Depression, because the federal government was creating these agencies to try and stop the impact of the Great Depression. And so when the Supreme Court struck down these agencies twice, when the powers have been delegated, the public was getting pretty upset. The president, FDR, was getting pretty upset. And he sent a letter to the Supreme Court. It was the court packing letter. And he said, hey, if you guys don't change your vote, I'm going to add an additional 6 justices to this. And I think there were 2 justices voting in favor of these agencies being constitutional. He said, I'm going to add another 6 that will vote yes, and we'll have 15 Supreme Court justices. And so the Supreme Court was at this place where they were saying, hey, strict reading of the Constitution doesn't allow this. And we don't think there's a compelling enough interest. People in America are getting super upset, saying the government has a strong interest in getting our economy going again. We want the help. We want all these things. And then the president saying, we're going to add 6 people to the Supreme Court. We're going to change the nature of it. And so when the third challenge came up, federal government passed another law delegating these things. Like in this situation, it was challenged again in court, brought up to the Supreme Court. And that time the Supreme Court said, yeah, we said this was wrong twice, but just kidding, it's constitutional. And there's a compelling enough interest in doing this. And since then, delegations like these have been accepted as appropriate. And it's
So
been
even way back then, they were pressuring the judicial system, which they're not supposed to do.
Yeah, and you can look up online and see the discussion about, they call it the switch in time that saved 9. If you Google that, you'll see the discussion about the threat from FDR to pack the court. And technically, again, we talk about that, but the Constitution did give the president the power to pick the number of Supreme Court justices. He can't take them off once they're on. They're appointed for life. But he has the constitutional authority to add more. Supposed to be able to be checked by the other branches. And so Congress and the executive branch were supposed to have some checks on the court, so they don't just do whatever they want. But in this scenario, the pressure came to let these things happen, they gave in and let it happen. But a lot of that still is understanding that the law that they're searching for when they ask a constitutional question is there a compelling enough interest? Is there a important societal objective that's being achieved? And when they say that, to me, that's just code for what's the moral good we're trying to accomplish with this law. And if it's a high enough moral good that they feel is necessary, they're going to let it go through, even if it violates the Constitution. And it's a sign to me that morality has always been the governing force in America. It even controls the Constitution and how it's interpreted. And so as a society, as we embrace new morality and we change morality, it starts to alter the basis of the governing law it's ultimately appealed to. And it's important to understand, because as our society changes views on things, it changes how the Constitution's interpreted, because the Constitution's always interpreted in light of compelling interests and what's a compelling interest for society.
So in the case, I relate this to the Ohio train derailment, and I could imagine if something like that happened in Utah and they want to basically freeze out the farmers, which is kind of a national trend these days, and a worldwide trend, actually, then, if that happened, Cox on his own could stop the water, right, from going to anyone in those rural areas. If
there was a train derailment or something.
If he deemed it toxic.
Potentially.
The risk of it, yeah.
Yeah, so this, let's see, HB 150.
The agenda, the UN agenda 2030, they want to get everyone out of the rural areas into the cities, the smart cities. So there is some speculation that what's going on around the country right now with the trains and the toxic spills and all that is actually one way of getting people out of those areas.
Well, yeah, and I think sorry, go ahead.
My concern is, didn't we at one point or another pass a bill giving the governor the right to declare an emergency on water?
So that is what we're looking at right now, this HB 150.
But I'm thinking that there was something passed prior to this being brought up that gives him the authority to declare that we have a state of emergency with water, or with something to where I wish I could. I was been trying to find the bill, but this one hand gives them control, and then this helps them to decide. And I'm looking for the other bill, but they kind of go hand in glove. But this one that I'm talking about was last year's, which is why he declared a water emergency this year.
Yeah, so the water emergency, it would be interesting to see what power he had before. This is adding a lot of power, this current bill.
Yeah, it does.
In what it can do. But one of the things, again, one of the checks in here that is put into place is that when we talk about the farmers or others, they do put these preferences in. And so the governor can't say, for example, that fire suppression is more important than drinking, because they're listing drinking as the highest thing, sanitation is the second highest, fire suppression is the third highest use of water. Commercial agriculture, animal welfare needs is the fourth. And so there is a nod to food and the need to keep those things functioning and going, and then electricity. And so, one of the things I see that happens quite often is, I'm always of the belief that there are people that conspire for power. They want power. They want to do things. But I'm also of the belief that almost anything can be seen as part of people conspiring, even if it's a natural reaction to society and where society's at. And I think that one of the things that is always important to look at is saying, what are the trends right now in society that might push someone to do this? Because if it's just purely someone seeking power and there's nothing associated with it, it's easier to defeat if you're fighting it or working against it. But if it's responding to something that actually exists in society and a concern and these other pieces, it's a lot more difficult to deal with. And maybe someone uses it, to gain power, maybe they don't. It's always an important question to ask because, again, the founders were ones that said, hey, make sure that you understand there needs to be checks and balances. If there's power available, people will seek it.
And I find it odd that they've taken the legislator out of this. That's what's a little odd and discomforting.
Mm-hmm.
Is that it's, why is our legislature wanting to be out of this decision, right?
Yeah,
it makes it easier for them to make him a scapegoat, and they don't have to take the brunt of it. But really, it's not the way our system is designed.
Correct. And one of the pieces I've pushed with powers to the governor is since COVID, when they all met online with COVID, I started pushing saying, hey, look, we used to give the governor power to act in emergencies because it took a little time for the legislature to convene. I said, but we're past that point now. The legislature now has the power to be called into a special session at any time. It can happen very quickly. It can be online. And we have very, very, very few emergencies where the governor needs to just step in and manage something. And so I agree that I think we should really push in society to say, no, we don't just give powers to the governor unless the legislature is unable to meet. There needs to have been a bomb or something like that that's gone off that stopped the legislature from meeting. But if the legislature can meet, let's make it meet. And like you say, let's make our elected officials who are tasked with these things to go through and represent everyone. We need the discussion in the legislature about, well, Salt Lake has over 1 million people. Well, people are producing food and animals and whatever. How do we manage the water? It needs to be this, this group talking about it, all the different needs, the constituents that are represented by the different elected officials. Those all need to be part of the discussion because that's how we balance things and make it work. There's no one group that should win necessarily with the water argument. And so I agree with you. Very much support that type of discussion.
We should also be worried when all of the legislators and the governor stand in blue suits on the steps of the Capitol for a photo op. That is a red flag right there, that they're up to something.
When they do photo ops together.
Did you see that? They did.
I did not see that.
They were all dressed in blue because they were propagandizing this bill.
So it was for this bill, huh?
Yeah. And water
I didn't get to see that.
Is blue. Water is blue, so they all dressed in blue and made a big deal of it, and Cox right there. You just know something's not right when they go to that extreme.
Yeah, I have someone else that says, whenever you see them making a big deal about something, you should be a little concerned.
Absolutely.
But it goes both ways. Sometimes they're super quiet about things and don't say anything, and some of those are concerning as well. So, but again, part of it is, as the public, we can attach a lot of value to something too and want people to, I don't know, get good for voting or whatever it is. But yes, Shirley, to your question, the governor can call a state of emergency for various things, but it's only what's granted by a code. And he has to have authority in code to declare that type of emergency. And sometimes even he can declare an emergency. So for example, the governor can say, hey, we have a state of emergency with flooding. But it doesn't mean he gets any real power. Sometimes governors just call the state of emergency because it brings in federal funding or something. Sometimes it lets them mobilize National Guard troops, but they don't get to pass new laws or regulations in every state of emergency. And that's up to the individual bills and laws about what power they have if there's an emergency versus what they don't.
Well, hasn't he declared a state of emergency for water? Isn't that one of the purposes of this bill?
So he has declared a state of emergency, but he hasn't had a lot of power to do too much about it. So this bill is giving him additional power to do something about it.
Yeah, therein lies my concern.
And so, yes, you know, and for example, the Great Salt Lake, we have bills about the Great Salt Lake. They've declared a state of emergency over the levels in the Great Salt Lake. And the governor did have the power to order that the berm be raised 5 feet, I think. So they've got I think it's on the north end. There's something that helps drain the lake when it's too full, and they increased that so that, you know, there's less water going out, or I don't know. But that was an executive order where he issued that order to raise it 5 feet. But to my knowledge, that could impact some businesses that use that water down the way. Now, again, if some businesses have to relocate to keep the Great Salt Lake, that's a discussion that I feel the legislature should have, probably. Where the different interests get represented, people get to talk through it, have that political process play out. But yes, but this has been a bill that's concerned me. I don't feel we should be giving the governor emergency powers when our legislature can meet.
Amen.
Especially when they can meet online. It just doesn't make any sense to me. But you also asked about HB 131, the vaccine passport. And currently, if you look at it, so you can kind of see where things stand. If you look at the status. So they have the Senate second reading. So the Utah Constitution requires that a bill is read 3 times before it can finally be voted on. And senators cast a informal vote when it's on the second reading, to kind of give everyone an idea of where it's at. And so right now, on the second reading, 19 people voted for it, 5 against it, and 5 didn't vote. So it looks like, based on the second reading, that it's most likely going to pass the third reading. Or actually, sorry, looking at this is the third reading that it's showing us here. Maybe past second reading, placed on the third reading calendar. Yeah, so this I think was second reading, because it doesn't say it passed the third reading yet. So to your question about the status of HB 131, it looks like it will pass.
Oh, okay, great. Yeah, and the difference between second or third reading and circling, is there a difference in that meaning?
Yeah, so if something's circled, what it means is that the legislature, it was up for vote. So you get in a queue essentially, and they just kind of go through the queue. And when it gets to be your turn to vote on it, the rep can say, "Oh, we're not quite ready. We're still trying to resolve some concerns or something. Let's circle it." And if it gets circled, it means it's put on pause and skipped, and it goes on to the next bill on the agenda. And so usually when something's circled, it usually means they weren't quite ready to vote on it. They're usually trying to resolve some concern somewhere, negotiate something. And so circled means it's been placed on pause. Someone's objected that they're working through. Or it was circled because the rep just wasn't available to be there. You know, maybe they had a baby or couldn't be there that day or something. That's a possibility.
Okay. Okay, thank you.
Yeah. So were there any other bills you wanted to look at or focus on? So one I wanted to bring up, we talked about it some at the start with child abuse reporting requirements. And I've I personally had a concern with those getting broader and broader because it can create this fear in people that they have to report everything if they see a bruise, if they see any of those, marks. And some of the people I've talked to about it have mentioned that, hey, if you're forced to report child abuse, it could put the child in more danger. It could put the reporter in more danger, because if you're a spouse and you have a violent, if your spouse is violent and you report him, you could get beat, you could have issues too. And trying to navigate those can be very difficult. And so I've always had concerns with mandatory child abuse reporting. And Utah had 2 bills this session that I saw recently in the news. They said they didn't think they'd move forward. They were trying to make it so that clergy had to report child abuse as well. But HB 515 is one that recently came out, and it takes a very interesting approach to this child abuse issue. And I actually really kind of like the balance I was trying to strike, but I'd be interested to hear your thoughts on it. So what it does is it goes through and it actually requires the reporting of what's called heinous abuse, or heinous neglect, which is more than just a bruise on a kid. They go through and talk about some of the things that are more serious in nature. So another word would be serious abuse or serious neglect. So if a kid comes to school, their arm's broken and they're crying and say, yeah, dad hit me, we should probably step in and do something at that point, for sure. But if they come to school with a bruise, to me, that's so questionable. And so this talks about those, it defines those. And then it talks about, so this used to say they've been the subject of abuse, and it's trying to amend that to say they've been the subject of heinous abuse or heinous neglect. And the person has reason to believe that the child is in imminent danger. Then they have to report it. Because this would be different than a scenario where 5 years ago you discovered the kid had been abused. And now, people have moved on or situations have changed. They also go through here, and this is talking about exceptions to those that don't have to report abuse. And this is a concern I've had in the past that they expressly put in here. They said that you're excused from reporting if you believe that you would be in immediate danger of death or serious bodily injury if you were to report. So again, you're in an abusive relationship or something. Require an extraordinary effort by the individual to make the report. I'm not exactly sure how you'd qualify for that. So that one I don't know too much about. But the third one is, or if you believe reporting would increase the danger to the child, then you don't have to report. And so this is the bill. I just wanted to point out that, a lot of bills we talk about being concerned about. This is a bill I actually feel is trying to strike a balance in protecting children, but not making our society so scared that they have to report everything. And giving people the leeway to say, ooh, am I going to be in more danger if I report this? Or is a child going to be in more danger if I report this? And so I just wanted to highlight it as what I felt was a good attempt at striking a balance to address serious concerns. But this bill was also just barely introduced. Hasn't even gone to committee yet, so I don't know what its chances of getting through this session. But curious to hear if any of you have thoughts on this balance it's trying to strike here.
I think Phil's done a good job, and I'm hoping and praying that it does make it to calendar.
Yeah, so you're supportive of it?
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, to me, it's, I certainly believe we have a duty to help children in our society. But I believe if we push that so far, we destroy normal parenting and, just the stress on parents and things, and never having a kid with a bruise and stuff gets really, really intense. So, but that's one. again, try and highlight some good things that they're doing. Because there are some, I think, bills that really try and strike a good balance. Another one that I think both of you would like is SB 250. Pull this one up. I saw this one. I know we've talked about some of these concerns before. Senator McKay is proposing a bill to ban public surveillance by the government. And that also bans them from paying private companies to capture surveillance and give it to them.
Yeah.
Would
That's
that
good.
mean they need to take down all these cameras they're putting up?
It would really impact that.
I hope so.
And so yeah. So this is saying the government-owned entity may not create, operate, or use a public surveillance footage network or contract with a private person to obtain, use, or copy private surveillance footage.
Well, if you see the birds disappear, then you'll know.
Say if we see the birds disappear, we'll know what?
You'll know that birds aren't real and that they're just surveillance cameras. Have you not heard that?
Gotcha. No, I never heard that.
There's people who say that birds aren't real, they're just surveillance.
Well, on that note, we lived in Michigan when I was going to law school, and we lived there with a bunch of other students or younger people, and our neighbors upstairs in the apartment complex we were in, he said that he worked for a company whose job was to create a robotic bat that could fly around and look like a bat, but it could be a surveillance capturing device, essentially. And that's what he was paid to do, is to create this robotic bat. He said they were having a hard time keeping it flying in wind. That was what they were struggling with. So there may be some truth to the birds there. Who knows? But yeah, maybe the pretty birds
So
singing
what-
outside our
what-
window or
what-
something else.
What kind of a chance do you think we would have of getting that one passed so late and everything?
Well, so the funny thing about things being late, so this one did get assigned to a committee. So House Rules acted on it very quickly and assigned it. So it came out essentially 17th, which would have been Friday. They had Monday with the holiday and things. So it got assigned. And it looks like it's actually scheduled on the agenda. That was actually out today at 4. So there you go. It's up in committee today at 4. So if it gets through committee today, I think there's a decent chance it could get through the House committee as well. So maybe that's one you two want to jump on for today at 4, is to talk in support of that.
Which committee is that?
This is the Senate Judiciary, Law Enforcement, and
Oh.
Criminal Justice Standing Committee.
Oh, okay.
And you can get there by just clicking on SB 250, clicking on hearings debate, and then it's scheduled right there. So you can pull it up. You can pull up the agenda.
Okay. Yeah, that's good. That would be great.
So that's the
So-
social worker licensing. Is that what you're talking about?
No, SB 250 is saying it wants to ban the government from having a public surveillance system.
You said 250?
Yeah,
Oh,
SB
all right.
250.
Okay, I was thinking of HB 250. Okay. Sorry.
Yeah,
Thank
so
you.
no worries. Yeah, so SB 250. Another one, Utah's really taken a swing at social media companies this session. There's another social media bill up that we can talk about. It's HB 524. And again, I have no idea what the chance is of this making it all the way through or not. But this is from Representative Ivory. He's an attorney, to my knowledge. And when we talk about constitutional things, we had some of that discussion. This actually I think there's some potential constitutional concerns with this bill. So it'll be interesting to see how that plays out. But
Isn't he a developer, Austin?
um,
Ivory?
Yeah, I think he's both.
yeah, I don't know on the development side. I know Ivory Homes is a developer company. I don't know if he's connected or not. I don't know that much about him.
I think it's his son, but I'm not sure.
But he has this bill that he wants to ban social media companies from censoring user expression. So the way he's approaching it is to say, let's have the social media company put out an acceptable use policy, he calls it. And so they have to publish to everyone what's allowed on their platform and what isn't. So he's saying that they still have the ability to say, for example, you can't talk about vaccines. But if they say you can't talk about vaccines, then nobody can talk about vaccines in the way he's pushing this. And so what he's saying is the social media company has the freedom to create the acceptable use policy. You have to publish it for everyone to see. And you then you have to follow your policy if you're going to take action against a user. And you can't take adverse actions against a user based on that user's viewpoint if it's a subject that you allow to be discussed on your platform. And then it also requires social media companies to publish, I think twice a year, a report on all of the adverse actions they take against users. So all the complaints they get, they have to have a complaint process. They have to have an appeal process. Because Facebook, for example, Facebook wouldn't run something for me once. Its robots flagged it as regulated speech that said wasn't allowed. And I can understand why Facebook or the robots felt it was that. It wasn't. If I could have talked to a human, I could have explained why it wasn't and shown them what the issue was. But Facebook never let me talk to a human. It was all just, even when I clicked a pill, I went to another robot and it just denied it. And so they're requiring that you, a social media company, have a real actual process. Users can actually get real help essentially from something more than a robot if they feel the policy's been violated. And then they have to publish a report of all the actions they're taking. So they have to publicly disclose every post they've removed, every ad they've denied, every user they've locked out, to show kind of the world of, are we following our policy, are we not? So I'm curious to see what your guys' thoughts are on this type of bill for social media companies.
I like it. Because just having been in that situation, I felt like I had no real good recourse. And this would at least allow you to hear from them their explanation for why they did it.
Yeah, it forces things to be a little bit more open. They have to have the policy, they have to follow it, they have to show all the actions they've taken. So attorneys can look at it, the big law firms, and can say, ooh, you're discriminating now, we're going to go after you.
Right. I think it would stop them from doing it because it's a hassle to have to document all this stuff.
Well, they're kind of up a creek in some ways because society's saying they're pushing to make social media companies liable if someone has violent threats on their platform.
Yeah.
And so they're saying to a social media company, hey, this person threatened to shoot up the school. Why didn't you do something about it?
Yeah.
And so they're being forced to regulate content essentially. But then we're telling them, well, we don't like how you're regulating it. And so we're now going to make you, be more open about it, which again, maybe is appropriate. We're trying to strike a balance. But I think originally, you had mentioned the constitutional concerns with the water bill, HB 150.
Yeah.
To me, this has constitutional concerns too, because what right does the government have to force someone to keep up content they disagree with? If I run a website and I say, hey, you can post here as long as it's a post that's in harmony with my religious beliefs. And I just don't want to hear from anyone that is here to bash my religious beliefs. Should I have freedom to say we'll allow one viewpoint but not the other, even though we're talking about religion?
Right,
And
right.
I think
That's what's good about this, as I understood it, is they have to say that we won't accept any topic, any on this topic.
well, but what it's forcing them to do is it's forcing them to accept a viewpoint that they disagree with. So if I say the topic of religion can be discussed, I can't then go in and say, but only viewpoints that support my religion.
Yeah,
And I then have to allow all viewpoints, and it can become pretty ugly and divisive and whatever, when I just want maybe a website where people comment and do things. And I just want it to be the ability to discuss and promote, a certain viewpoint. But I'm saying I don't want to give space and time on my website to these other viewpoints that detract from it. And so this does let the company pick subjects, so they can say, we won't allow the subject of violence, no violent threats on here, and no matter the violent threat, whether it's against Republican or Democrat, we have to take it off.
yeah,
But I think that, to me, the concern comes up more in saying, are we violating the First Amendment when we say, but you have to allow both viewpoints, both sides of the viewpoints for the subjects you allow? That's where I think it's going to run into constitutional issues, personally. Because on a freedom of speech basis, as an individual or as an owner of a company, I should be able to say, I think a lot of people would argue under the Constitution, I should be able to choose what you can say on my site. Walmart should be able to keep negative reviews off its site. Maybe they'll be on Google, maybe they'll be wherever. But if Walmart has a site where 50 million people can comment, and they say we only allow good comments on here,
right.
I don't know. It's one where I think they'll probably argue there's a compelling public interest in open dialogue and discourse and all those things, and I agree with that. I'm just not convinced that our courts will allow this. But again, looking at it from the way he's choosing to approach it, I think a lot of it could survive constitutional scrutiny. For example, requiring a company to publish what they do and don't enforce, what they do kick off, what they don't allow.
Yeah,
I think that could pass. And I think even requiring them to disclose adverse actions they've taken to show compliance with their acceptable use policy, that will probably pass muster. I just don't know for sure about the ban on censorship. Whether that one passes or not.
It's interesting because, I feel like, and well, actually, I don't know, but I feel like, a lot of conservatives feel like they were, shadow banned or whatnot through social media, and maybe the other side feels the same way. I don't know. And I don't know.
They are starting to feel that way more.
Well, yeah, now that other people have come around, that's for sure. But so on the one hand, it'd be interesting to be able to show like, oh, wow, yeah, the majority are this type of person. But then I think that just still opens up a whole other can of worms of, them still going through and selecting the content, and are we going to force a 50-50 after that, after we see it's not 50-50? I think it would be really interesting and probably a step of accountability, but I just wonder if that just opens up a whole other can of worms and if it doesn't actually solve a whole lot.
Yeah, no, it's a great question, because we have this issue, the societal notion that things should have equal airtime or equal attention. Even though, for example, if we were to give equal attention to LGBTQ issues as we do to, just the non-LGBTQ, side of things, we would have, it would be disproportionate to the actual population. LGBTQ is a very small minority still in the population. And it doesn't mean we shouldn't talk about their issues and shouldn't talk about those things. But if we were to say, to your point, Matt, that, oh, well, look, you know, the discussion is 70% this and 30% that, or 80-20, are we going to start to push to equalize it more? Because that type of thing has happened with actions like affirmative action, where they say, you know, in some companies have become, some states, California, for example, has become very aggressive about this, where they're saying, hey, your board of directors in a company needs to be 50-50 male and female. And you have to have X%, you know, minority people in it or something. And if the company doesn't match the demographics of society, they're getting hammered for it. I interviewed at a big law firm in Michigan when I was in law school, very reputable firm, very large. And it was a whole round of interviews, you know, throughout the day. And I went through them all, got very good recommendations from each attorney that I met with. And I get up to the last interview was with the vice president of the company or the firm. And, you know, this is back in 2008, 2009. And he held up the papers and he says, Austin, he goes, you've gotten great reviews through all your interviews. And he says, there was one, for example, there was a guy in the construction law group that really wanted to hire me. He was looking for a replacement, someone he could train and then move out into retirement. No one at the firm was interested in construction law. I'd done construction and things. And so he really wanted that. But the vice president said, he says, you have great reviews. He goes, on paper, you're a great fit. You've got, you know, you check all the boxes. He says, but I can promise you that this firm will never be able to hire you. And I said, oh, well, I just, you know, spent a whole day going through interviews, you know, why is that? And he says, because he says, we are required to have a certain % of female attorneys here. And he says, we have to hire more females. We don't have enough. He goes, we can't hire any more males right now. And he says, we hire a lot of female attorneys. He goes, but most of them get burned out and quit and have a child and decide that big firm life's not for them. And so it was interesting to see some of that, to say, and again, maybe it was a cop out. Maybe he didn't want to hire me and was using that as an excuse. You know, it's always a possibility. But he said, I want you to know you got really good reviews. On paper, you should be hired, but we won't be able to, because as a officer of the company, I have to get more female attorneys in here, or else we're in trouble with the law. And so to your point, Matt, I think that's something that could start to happen is, does it start to skew perception of reality if we see half and half on things or whatnot? You know, do things become less important than they should be because we don't see it enough? Does it become more important than it should be because we see it too much? And what type of impact does that have if we see that, oh yeah, 90% of things that are shut down are X? Is our response then to try and force equality with that? And so it's a good point.
Austin.
Yep.
One of the things I experienced in the legislature, I attended on Zoom the ranked choice voting hearing. And there were a lot of people there because there's a lot of discussion and voices. And there were probably more for than against. And so I had waited like through the whole thing. It took hours, this hearing. And we got to the end and the chair said, well, let's hear on Zoom just the people who are against it. I couldn't believe it. That, to me, that was not right. I don't care. That's not his job to do that.
To pick the side that gets to talk.
To silence my voice, you know, and I still put my hand up and I was going to say, I am against you voting against this bill.
Nice.
Well, I attended one of those ranked choice voting committees and it was just the opposite. There was only 2 people against it. And there was like 16, there was 16 people against it and 2 people for it.
Really?
Yeah, and it frustrated me that he did the same thing at that meeting. He said, well, do we have any more that are against it? But the 2, that were for it, but the 2 that were for it were small counties. When you only have 2 people running on ranked choice voting, well, hello, it isn't a big deal. And they were both saying how much money they save with ranked choice voting, and these were both auditors. But he still did the same thing, and he asked, well, is there any people, any more people that are for it? And it was clearly to me that he was wanting ranked choice voting, and he only wanted to hear from the people that wanted it, as opposed to those of us that were against us, because there was a lot of people that did not have the opportunity to speak, because he said we had to give other people a chance online.
Yeah, there's a lot of power in being a committee chair.
Yep.
And making those decisions and calls. And when the Constitution gives us the freedom of speech and the right to petition the government for redress of grievances and all those things, it's never been held to say that every single person can testify at a committee. They still allow them to do time, place, and manner restrictions on speech to an extent. And so those do happen, and they are very frustrating to go up to a committee hearing, sit there, and then them say, yeah, we're not interested in hearing from you.
Well, they give you 60 seconds to say it all.
Yeah, they give you 60 seconds, or sometimes if you're lucky, you get 2 minutes. And yeah, if they go over, you have some really important thing you're saying, you may be in tears saying something, and the buzzer sounds and they'll say, move on, please. And
yep.
Yeah, it is interesting. But again, on the flip side, if you could just get up and talk as long as you wanted, and you could just start reading from the Bible and totally take over a committee hearing, pull a filibuster type thing. So there is, again, the government, the Supreme Court looks and says, well, yeah, you have to have some level of control. You can't just let people hijack the meeting and take away everyone else's rights. But is there a proper balance currently? I think it's weighted a little too much in favor of the committee chair.
I agree.
And I wouldn't mind having a little bit more ability to testify on things. And one of the things that I've actually become very interested in pushing is a requirement that for a bill to be voted on, if it's not an emergency, some type of big emergency they got to fix, that they've got to put it out, let's say 4 months before the session or something like that. So the public can have a chance to see it, talk about it, digest it, go through all those things. I'm not a fan of a bill popping up, being sent to committee, being heard, everyone scrambling, trying to get up there, trying to talk about it. I think we should really promote this public participation aspect to it. And I don't know, I'm very interested in a bill that says, yeah, if you're going to present something to the legislature, you got to be made public for 3 or 4 months ahead of time, so that we all have the chance to go through these, be more thoughtful about it, and really pass better legislation, in my opinion, if we all have a chance to weigh in, as opposed to, oh, you're 20th on the list today, so we're only going to take 2 people and that's it.
Right.
Because it doesn't accomplish its purpose of public input and the whole process.
Well, it would give the legislators a better chance as well.
Yeah, I think it would help everyone. I think that the laws would be so much better if we had more time in the process.
I agree.
And so I'm still a fan of a limited legislature that only meets part-time. I don't like full-time legislatures whose only job is to pass law. But I just thought, we could just say, talk about your bills, send them to drafting, get the drafting attorneys to do most of their work before the session, give them a break over Christmas because the bill has to be public by then. And then they can do all the amendments and revisions and whatever else that takes place. But put it out there, let the public talk about it, know about it. And so that's a bill that I might brainstorm, see if we can figure out how to get something like that through. I'd be very interested in that.
I was just gonna say, you're an attorney, suggested.
Yeah. So this
Yeah,
is this
that's
is one
cool.
that maybe one of my projects that I tackle is, can we get the legislature to agree to that? I'm
Yeah.
sure they won't like it. So maybe it needs to be a ballot proposition. We get everyone in Utah to sign. I don't know, but
Yeah,
but we'll see.
good idea.
But yeah, but thanks for your time joining us today. And we have the one more meeting tomorrow night at 7, and then we'll be done for the session this time around. But again, you can reach out with questions or anything. So we appreciate your comments. If you have things you support, be sure to support those. If you have concerns, be sure to share your concerns. And we appreciate all of you and your efforts to help Utah be a good place. So thank you all.
for all you do. Appreciate it.
Yeah, thank you.